One of the things that I want to talk to you about in this video is um, we talked about the politics as the social institution that is concerned with the ability or decision-making processes as it relates to the distribution of resources, but also to the distribution of power. So we have to talk specifically about what power is. And the way that I'll share my screen to talk about power. Let me get you here. So there's three things that I want to talk to you about, actually: power, legitimacy, and authority. And I think this diagram helps us to see how those three things relate. And we get this type of framework from Max Weber. Power is the ability to exercise your will over another, the ability to exercise one's will over another, essentially the ability to make others do what it is that they wouldn't have done, or how to get people to do things that you want them to do. That power can happen in a lot of ways. There's a lot of sources of power. Sometimes the power to get people to do things that you want them to do comes just from the strength of an idea. So we were just talking about sort of political leanings. If you have a political leaning toward the idea of liberty, then you're probably going to do those things that are best going to ensure liberty, even if it's not really something that you want to do. You might give up your expectation for protection in some way because it's the thing that maintains freedom, right? And on the other side, if you agree with justice for all, then you might give up some of your liberties in order to ensure that everybody gets a piece of the pie, right? So it can be an idea. It can be money. People can pay you a certain amount of money to do all kinds of things, which is why we tend to see that when we think about the elites in a government structure, even in an informal way, we tend to think about people who are very wealthy. Their money, contributions to political parties, contributions to interest groups who lobby the government, for instance, can be very influential. So power often comes from wealth. The fact that you go to work and do what somebody tells you to do every day because they pay you is a source of power. Sometimes power comes in the power of numbers, and we'll talk about social movements and collective action. If you have one person who asks you for your lunch money, maybe you're not going to do it, but if 10 people showed up at once and ask you for your lunch money, then you don't think about it. So that power can come in a number of ways. Another one of those ways that we tend to think about power comes is by way of force or by way of violence. And you don't want to sort of resort to force and violence, which is why you might try to rely on those other things, ideas and numbers of people or even money. But power can come in force or violence. In the ideal sense, you want power that is also backed by authority. And by definition, authority is power that people accept because it comes from a source that we perceive to be legitimate. We perceive it to be power that you should have. And so we don't believe that you are coercing us. We don't believe that you're just saying the things that we want you to hear by idea, for instance. We don't believe that you are showing up to ask me to do something or tell me to do something with 10 of your friends because you think that I'm going to be scared. We don't think that when you offer me money to do it, that you're just trying to buy me off. Or we don't think that you are, trying to be threatening. People in power or positions of power want you to believe that they have the authority to do that. They want you to perceive that power to be legitimate. Legitimacy is the belief that a leader or an institution or governing body has the right to exercise the authority. Again, they want that authority to be perceived as legitimate so that the power of getting people to do what it is that they want them to do is done in a way that you'll just do it because you perceive my power to be legitimate. You will do it because I am an authority to do so. And if you perceive my authority to be legitimate, then you'll just do it because I asked. Again, of course, you get paid at work in order to do your job, but you also recognize that the structure says your manager or your supervisor is in this formal organization. They have the authority to tell you to do what you're supposed to do within reason, right? That's why when the Babysitters Club pulled out their spiral notebook and decided this is going to be our organizational rules, they're saying who's going to make these decisions, who's going to have the power to make those decisions. And we don't want them to have to fight to get people to do what they need them to do all the time. We are deciding the rules are this. And so the power to make this decision is legitimate based on these rules that we wrote. So when we say that this person is the president and make that decision, we're giving them the authority to utilize their power to make us to do something. So that's the relationship between power, legitimacy, and authority. And the important things about legitimacy, or the belief that somebody has the right to exercise authority, is that some things we might consider to be illegitimate, that a leader, institution, or governing party does not have the proper legal or moral authority to use their power. So there can be somebody in power, for instance, that is arguing that they have the legitimate authority to utilize that power. If we don't believe or agree in the legitimacy of that power, then we are challenging whether or not they have the authority to utilize that power to get us to do what it is we want to do. So if you're at work and your manager or your supervisor says, I need you to stay until 9 o'clock tonight, and it's not in your job description, you might say, you've got the authority to tell me to do some things, but it is not a legitimate power of yours, or you don't have legitimate authority to tell me that I can't leave when my shift is over, right? So we're always concerned if power is simply just the ability to exercise your will over somebody else's, and where that power comes from is important. You have to either perceive it as rightfully there or not, and we know what's rightfully there or not based on systems of legitimacy that we have predetermined. So what I want to show you is different forms of authority. Again, legitimate forms or authority. And there are three types that we like to talk about. One of them is traditional legitimacy or traditional authority. It is power legitimized in the base of long-standing traditions. So when we think about those monarchs, right, those government types where there is a person who is a monarch, we tend to think that this person is a monarch and it's going to be this person's son, and then it's going to be this person's son, often because we're talking about long-standing customs or traditions that decide who's the person that's going to be in power. Sometimes that traditional power is almost sacred. Sometimes it might be in a lineage pattern that we thought was God-given. So when we think about royal families, again, we're usually talking about traditional power. If you think about people in your city, for instance, where we say that family has always been in leadership in the city, so we are likely going to continue to look to them as the leaders of this city because their names are recognized. They generally are participating in this way, and so it is tradition. And you don't usually talk about it as tradition, but it is traditional authority or legitimacy that we're going to respect their authority and do the things that they ask them to do. Some of that authority or legitimacy, some of that authority is backed by the legitimacy of some rational legal system that we've created. So a rational legal type of authority is a power that is legitimized by rules and regulations and laws. We sometimes talk about rational legal authority as bureaucratic authority. And think about the executive branch of the US government or any one of the branches of the US government, for instance. Again, when we talk about a democracy or a representative democracy or the Babysitters Club, you're saying we wrote the rules. We formalized the rules. We determined what the laws are. We made them legal. We created the rationality about why this person should do this, and we wrote it all down. So the person who has the authority to exercise their power in this particular decision is legitimized to use their power to make that decision because we created the system that legitimizes their authority used. The legitimizer in that case is the US Constitution or the spiral notebook that the Babysitters Club put together. So it's a rational legal authority. Charismatic authority is based on the leader's exceptional personal quality. So when we think about believing in a particular person because we believe in their moral character, for instance, and then it doesn't even have to be their actual qualities, it can be those things that we've imagined about them. Sometimes it is just very apparent, maybe during a crisis, or somebody is standing on the mountaintop or on the soapbox, and they're promising that they are going to lead us to a greater good. So you see this in times of crisis, or you see this in times of war, or again, sometimes it could be just the family or the person who is placed in that leadership position. They make the best speeches, or they're the funniest. In a very real sense, this is when we think of a person like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Even before he was in any rational legal type of leadership position of any kind of organization, sometimes you have a person who becomes the figure of a movement or the leadership image of a person who we see. And in some ways, we follow them because we believe in them, not necessarily because they've done anything before. We don't even have to even know them. It's just something about them that we're following. Monarchs are sometimes charismatic, and they've been put in positions where they have this traditional authority to exercise their power, but they also want you to believe in them and follow them and like them. Dictators sometimes gain their ability to rule in that way based on their charisma. If they can get you to follow them and believe in the things that they say, then they can sometimes have you following them right on into the crisis itself, because they've convinced you by virtue of their personality and their sort of ability to just get you to hold on to the person who they are. An interesting thing is that I think the US president becomes a very interesting person when we talk about these different types of authority. A person who is able to use their power to get you to do things for them isn't necessarily only using one type of power, right? When we look at US presidents in our society, for instance, sometimes they have that power because of tradition. When we think of presidents who have served for a very long time, or presidents who are the son of other presidents, or presidents who were vice presidents in one term and then whatever, sometimes it's kind of tradition. Like, you've been in the government forever and ever, and your family has been in the government forever and ever. When we think about the Kennedys or the Bushes, for instance, you have a certain amount of traditional authority. Sometimes we assume that you must know what you're doing because that's your last name, right? So we see presidents who might be able to utilize their family name to put them in positions of power that grant them authority based on that family name. Rational legal authority, clearly there's election processes, and we have a constitution and government agencies that specifically say who you are. But because we are a representative democracy, you're probably not going to get that authority, if you will. We're not going to legitimize your authority so that you can use your power unless you got a little bit of charisma. You're probably not even going to win the election if you don't have some of this charisma. When you think about the Bush family, for instance, and you had George Bush Sr. and then George Bush Jr., Jeb Bush couldn't even win the primaries to make it to the general election, partially because he just lacked the same kind of charisma, particularly with the range of people that had the kind of charisma to go far in the primaries, for instance. He just didn't have it, even though he may have been able to follow on that traditional authority and certainly could have been in a position to have rational legal authority. He was the governor, so he certainly was electable, but what he was lacking was a bit of that charisma to make people believe in them. So it's a cool thing about the US president, for instance, is that they have a great way to sort of be representative of all of these types of authority. So that's going to be the end of this video.